The bustling corridors of the Academy of Universal Knowledge hummed with anticipation as alien students converged on the Human Cultural Studies wing. Among them was Eni, a pale-skinned Cathari with large, luminescent eyes, and Ilix, a scaled, whip-thin Serakian with a penchant for overanalyzing. Both were eager to attend the special seminar on human first aid, a subject infamous among interstellar academics for its peculiar and often baffling methods. "I've heard humans have a strange and almost reckless approach to injuries," Eni murmured to Ilix, her voice tinged with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Unique is an understatement," Ilix replied, his voice dry. "I've read accounts of them using substances like duct tape and something called a stapler to close wounds. Barbaric, if you ask me." As the duo took their seats in the amphitheater-style classroom, the room's ambient hum quieted. The instructor, a tall, broad-shouldered human named Sergeant Grant Marshall, strode to the front. His uniform was clean but worn, a testament to years of service. A long scar ran across his forearm, stark against his sun-bronzed skin, and his sharp blue eyes scanned the room with practiced ease. "Welcome," he began, his deep voice commanding instant attention. "Today, we're diving into an essential part of human culture, first aid. But let me be clear, this isn't just about fixing cuts and bruises. It's about survival. Humans evolved on a deathworld, and our methods reflect that." The term deathworld elicited murmurs from the audience. Deathworlders were known for their resilience and audacity, traits that made them both fascinating and terrifying to other species. But the idea of humans, who appeared so physically fragile compared to most aliens, thriving in such conditions was a concept that many struggled to grasp. Sergeant Marshall raised a hand to silence the murmurs. "I've got a volunteer today. Meet Private Jackson." A wiry young man with tousled dark hair and a mischievous grin stepped forward, giving a jaunty wave to the audience. He wore a standard-issue field uniform, and his casual demeanor seemed to put some of the more nervous students at ease. Marshall clapped Jackson on the shoulder. "Private Jackson has volunteered for this. Believe me, he's seen worse." The uneasy chuckles that rippled through the crowd were cut short when Marshall drew a small blade from his belt and, without hesitation, slashed a shallow line across Jackson's forearm. Crimson blood welled up immediately. Gasps of horror rippled through the room. Eni's glowing eyes went wide, and Ilix recoiled so violently his chair nearly toppled over. "Relax," Marshall said calmly. "This is controlled. Now pay attention." Private Jackson, unfazed, simply held out his bleeding arm. Marshall pulled a small black bag from his belt and began rummaging through it. Rule number 1 of human first aid: improvise. Out in the field, you won't always have access to medical supplies. But humans, we're problem solvers. He retrieved a roll of duct tape and a sterile gauze pad, holding them up for the class to see. "For example, this. Ideally, you'd have proper adhesive bandages, but in a pinch, duct tape will do the trick." With practiced efficiency, he pressed the gauze against Jackson's wound and secured it with strips of duct tape. "It's not pretty, but it'll hold until you can get proper treatment. Now, who wants to try?" The room fell silent. The alien students exchanged nervous glances, none eager to approach the blooded human. Finally, Eni raised a tentative hand. "Brave choice," Marshall said with a nod. "Come on up." Eni hesitated before rising, her spindly frame trembling slightly as she made her way to the front. Marshall handed her a fresh gauze pad and roll of duct tape. "All right," he instructed. "Apply pressure to the wound first. That's key. Then secure it." Eni's delicate fingers fumbled with the gauze as she gingerly pressed it against Jackson's arm. The sticky tape proved even more challenging, clinging to her fingers instead of the gauze. "Good effort," Marshall said, taking over to show her the proper technique. "The key is confidence. Hesitation can cost lives." As Eni returned to her seat, Ilix leaned over. "This is madness. They act as though injuries are mere inconveniences." Eni nodded, but there was a spark of intrigue in her eyes. "Maybe that's why they survive. They don't let fear stop them." The lesson continued with more demonstrations. Marshall showed how to use a belt as a tourniquet, how to stitch wounds with makeshift needles, and even how to set a broken bone using splints fashioned from tree branches. Each demonstration left the audience torn between fascination and sheer disbelief, their expressions a mix of awe and shock. By the end of the session, the alien students were visibly overwhelmed. Some whispered among themselves, questioning the sanity of human practices, while others, like any, seemed to view the methods as a testament to human ingenuity. As the students filed out, Marshall called after them, "Next session, we'll cover field amputations. Don't be late." The class erupted into nervous chatter. Eni and Ilix walked together, their usual banter subdued. "What do you think?" Eni asked after a long silence. Ilix shook his head. "I think humans are either the most resourceful species in the galaxy or the most reckless. Perhaps both." Eni glanced back at the classroom door, where Sergeant Marshall stood watching them with a faint smile. "I think there's more to learn from them than we realize." Her words lingered as the two disappeared down the corridor, the spark of curiosity igniting a flame that would lead to far greater revelations than either could anticipate. The following week, the students stepped into the Human Cultural Studies wing, their apprehension giving way to cautious curiosity as they eyed the unusual setup before them. The room was set up differently this time. A variety of objects lay spread across a long table at the front: tools, cloth scraps, tubes, liquids, and a pile of what looked suspiciously like sticks. Sergeant Marshall stood at the center, his arms crossed, an unmistakable gleam of challenge in his eyes. Private Jackson leaned casually against the table, his forearm now bandaged neatly but visibly. "Welcome back," Marshall began. "Today, we're going deeper. Improvisation isn't just a skill for humans, it's the difference between life and death, honed over millennia of facing the unpredictable. And no species improvises better than humans. Your challenge: fix Jackson's injury using only what's on this table. No advanced tech, no outside help. Just these materials." The students exchanged nervous glances. Ilix leaned toward Eni. "Using sticks and scraps to fix injuries? It's completely illogical," Ilix muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "And yet, we're here," Eni replied, her tone equal parts skepticism and intrigue. She gestured to the table. "Let's see what they expect us to do." Marshall stepped aside, motioning for the students to approach. "You have 10 minutes. Work in teams. Go." The room erupted into a flurry of activity. Students clustered around the table, their movements hesitant at first but growing bolder as the seconds ticked by. Eni and Ilix found themselves grouped with a towering Zalithian named Grak, whose 4 arms proved to be both a blessing and a logistical nightmare. "We need to stop the bleeding first," Eni said, grabbing a handful of gauze. "Pressure is key, right?" "Yes, but what if we—" Ilix trailed off, examining a tube labeled superglue. His scaled fingers flipped the tube over, reading the small print. "This says it bonds almost instantly. Perhaps it could seal the wound." Grak's deep voice rumbled. "Seal a wound with glue? That's absurd." "Humans are absurd," Eni said, shrugging. "But absurdity seems to work for them." They quickly set to work. Eni applied pressure to Jackson's arm while Ilix cautiously dripped the glue along the edges of the shallow cut. Grak used his extra hands to steady the arm and prepare a rudimentary bandage using strips of cloth and a small stick to secure it. Across the room, other groups tackled the challenge with varying degrees of success. One team created a haphazard sling using cloth and tape, while another attempted to craft a makeshift sealant using powder and water, ending in a sticky mess. One team wrapped Jackson's arm entirely in cloth, creating a bulky but functional bandage. Another attempted to use a combination of water and powder to create a paste, though their efforts resulted in more of a mess than a solution. As the 10 minutes wound down, Marshall clapped his hands. "Time's up. Let's see what you've got." Each team presented their solution, and Marshall evaluated them with a mix of humor and seriousness. When it came to Eni's group, he raised an eyebrow at the glued wound. "Superglue?" he asked, his tone neutral but curious. "It's efficient," Ilix said, straightening. "And it worked?" Marshall nodded. "Not bad. Improvised wound closures using adhesives are a real human technique. It's not perfect, but in emergencies, it can save lives." "Well done." Ilix's posture relaxed slightly, a hint of pride flashing across his face. Annie and Grack exchanged a glance, their earlier doubts replaced by a growing respect for human adaptability. Marshall turned to the rest of the class. This exercise wasn't just about fixing a cut. It's about thinking outside the box, using what you have, and working as a team. That's what survival looks like. He let the words sink in before continuing. Now, let's talk about pain management. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Pain was a concept that most advanced species had long since mastered through neural blockers and advanced pharmaceuticals. The idea of managing pain without such aids was almost inconceivable. Marshall retrieved a small vial of a clear liquid from the table and held it up. This is alcohol. Humans have used it for centuries, to clean wounds, to numb pain, and sometimes just to stay sane. But let me show you another technique. He motioned Jackson forward again and handed him a wooden stick. Bite down on this, Marshall instructed. Jackson obeyed without question, placing the stick between his teeth. Marshall turned back to the class. In extreme situations, when there's no access to painkillers, distraction and physical resilience are our tools. You focus the mind elsewhere. Sometimes that's biting down on something or even enduring the pain to get the job done. It's not pretty, but it's effective. The demonstration sparked an animated debate among the students. Many questioned the ethics and practicality of such methods, while others marveled at the sheer willpower it must take to endure pain in such a way. Humans have a strange relationship with pain, Ilix said quietly to Annie as they observed. It's almost as if they see it as a challenge. Maybe that's why they're so good at surviving, Annie replied. Pain doesn't deter them, it drives them forward, turning adversity into determination. By the end of the session, the students were both impressed and unsettled. The exercises had challenged their perceptions of what was necessary for survival. For Annie and Ilix, in particular, the day's lessons left them with a new understanding of human resilience and a nagging question about how far they themselves would be willing to go to survive. As the class dispersed, Marshall's voice followed them out the door. Next time, we tackle improvised field surgery. Come prepared. Excited murmurs filled the Human Cultural Studies wing as students rushed in, their steps quick and eyes wide with curiosity. Whispers darted back and forth like sparks. The anticipation had only grown since the last session, fueled by both the practical challenge of the exercises and the undeniable allure of human resilience. Sergeant Marshall stood at the front, as always, with Private Jackson by his side. This time, Jackson's arm bore not only the remnants of their previous experiments but also a few new scars, which he displayed with a wry grin. The table in front of them displayed a peculiar mix of tools, a hammer, fishing line, and a butane torch, each hinting at grim yet resourceful possibilities. Welcome back, Marshall said, his voice carrying the weight of both command and camaraderie. Today, we're talking about one of the toughest situations you might face in the field surgery. Now, let me be clear. This is not about perfection. This is about survival. A collective shudder passed through the room. The term field surgery was enough to unsettle even the most stoic among them. Annie glanced at Ilix, who seemed to have shrunk slightly in his seat. Field surgery? Ilix whispered. This cannot end well. Annie's glowing eyes narrowed, a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. It's madness. But that's why we're here, isn't it? Marshall raised his hand, silencing the murmur of the crowd. Field surgery, a brutal but essential part of Deathworld survival, demands not just skill but an iron will. You don't always have the luxury of sterile rooms or professional surgeons. Sometimes, it's just you, your wits, and whatever tools you can find. He turned to Jackson. Private, ready? Jackson gave a mock salute. Always, Sergeant. Marshall gestured to the table. Today's scenario, you've got a deep laceration that's bleeding heavily. You're miles away from proper medical facilities. Your mission? Stop the bleeding, close the wound, and stabilize the patient. The catch? You've only got what's on this table. The students stared at the assortment of items with wide eyes. A hammer. Fishing line. The tools seemed more suited to a workshop than a medical emergency. Let's start with a demonstration, Marshall said, rolling up his sleeves. He selected the fishing line and a curved needle from the array, holding them up for the class to see. In a pinch, this can be used to suture a wound. It's not ideal, but it works. With steady hands and meticulous precision, he stitched the synthetic flesh, the gleaming needle tracing clean lines under the overhead lights. The room was silent, save for the soft scrape of the needle and the steady cadence of Marshall's voice as he explained each step. When he finished, he held up the stitched material. Not pretty, but functional. And sometimes, that's all that matters. He turned to the class. Now, it's your turn. Pair up and replicate what I just showed you. And remember, this isn't about aesthetics. It's about saving lives. The room erupted into activity as the students paired off. Eni and Ilix found themselves working together again, their earlier camaraderie tempered by the gravity of the task. "This is insane," Ilix muttered as he examined the fishing line. "Who thinks of this?" "Humans, apparently," Eni replied, threading the needle with surprising dexterity. "Let's just focus." Their attempts were clumsy at first. Ilix's hands trembled as he tried to guide the needle, and Eni struggled to maintain steady pressure on the synthetic flesh. Across the room, similar frustrations played out as students grappled with the crude tools and their own inexperience. But slowly, progress emerged. Eni and Ilix's stitches, while uneven, began to hold. A few tables away, Grak's forearms proved to be an advantage as he simultaneously stitched and applied pressure, his team's work earning an approving nod from Marshall. After a grueling half-hour, Marshall called for their attention. "Time's up. Let's see what you've got." He moved from table to table, examining each team's work with a critical eye. Some stitches were too loose, others too tight. But his critiques were balanced with encouragement, and his praise for their effort was genuine. When he reached Eni and Ilix's table, he studied their work closely. "Not bad," he said finally. "A little rough around the edges, but it'd hold in an emergency. Good teamwork." Ilix's shoulders relaxed, and Eni allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Marshall returned to the front of the room. "The point of this exercise isn't just to teach you techniques. It's to show you that survival often means making do with what you have. Humans have a saying, adapt, improvise, and overcome. In a skirmish on Luna 12, that very mindset turned a hopeless ambush into a daring escape for an entire unit. And it's a lesson that applies to anyone, regardless of species." As the students absorbed his words, Marshall's expression softened. "Look, I know this is tough. But the galaxy is tough. And the more you prepare for the worst, the better your chances of coming out the other side. That's what this is all about." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. For the first time, the alien students truly understood the human approach to survival. It wasn't about elegance or efficiency. It was about determination, grit, and an unyielding refusal to give up. As they filed out of the room, Ilix turned to Eni. "Do you think we'll ever need to use this?" Eni's glowing eyes reflected a newfound resolve. "I hope not. But if we do, at least we'll be ready." The final session of the Human Cultural Studies seminar brought a mixture of anticipation and bittersweet reflection. The students had grown accustomed to Sergeant Marshall's gruff wisdom and the enigmatic presence of Private Jackson, whose scars now seemed less intimidating and more like badges of honor. The classroom felt charged, with students sitting straighter, their tails flicking nervously and antennae twitching. Some exchanged quick, uneasy glances, while others tapped their fingers or shuffled their feet, as if bracing for something extraordinary. The table at the front was empty this time, save for a single object, a small, nondescript mirror. Marshall stood beside it, his arms crossed and his expression unusually solemn. "Welcome to your final lesson," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "You've learned a lot over the past few weeks. You've seen how humans improvise, adapt, and endure. But today, we're going to talk about the most important tool you'll ever have." He stepped aside and gestured to the mirror. The students shifted uneasily, their expressions a mix of confusion and curiosity. "The most critical tool for survival isn't on a table," Marshall continued. "It's not something you can hold in your hands. It's right here." He tapped his temple, letting the silence hang for a moment. Around the room, students shifted uncomfortably, some frowning in thought while others exchanged quiet murmurs. Ennie's glowing eyes narrowed with realization, while Ilix's claws tapped rhythmically against the desk, his usual skepticism giving way to a begrudging curiosity. Your mind. And today, we're going to test it. Private Jackson stepped forward, holding a small device that emitted a faint hum. This, he explained, is a simulated survival scenario. You'll each take a turn experiencing it. The goal? Make it out alive. The students' unease grew, but Ennie and Ilix exchanged a glance that carried a mix of determination and trepidation. One by one, the students stepped up to the device. A Zalithian's frills flared with tension as he gripped the table for support, his breathing uneven. His mind raced, cycling through the lessons of the past weeks, though doubt gnawed at him. Was he truly ready for this? The image of Marshall's steady demeanor floated to his thoughts, pushing back the fear with a flicker of determination. A Cathari student emerged moments later, her luminescent eyes wide with what seemed like both terror and awe, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of her seat. The simulation varied for each participant, throwing them into scenarios that tested not just their knowledge but their ability to remain calm under pressure. When it was Ennie's turn, she hesitated only briefly before stepping forward. The device buzzed softly as it activated, and her body tensed. She found herself in an alien jungle, her senses overwhelmed by the cacophony of sounds and the oppressive heat. A sharp pain in her leg made her look down to see a gash and the tools to address it scattered around her. She had mere moments to decide what to do before the simulated predators closed in. Her hands moved with surprising confidence, though her heart pounded like a war drum in her chest. Her breath hitched as the jungle's humid air thickened around her, amplifying the metallic tang of blood and the distant growls. She wrestled with the panic clawing at the edges of her mind, replaying Marshall's steady instructions in her head, focus. Step by step. The humid air clung to her skin, mingling with the sharp, metallic tang of her own sweat. She fought the urge to panic, her glowing eyes darting to the tools scattered on the jungle floor. The stench of decaying vegetation and the distant growls of predators made every moment feel like an eternity. Drawing on lessons from the previous sessions, she cleaned the wound with trembling hands, the sting biting through her focus. Fashioning a crude bandage from nearby leaves and fibers, she began limping toward safety, her ears straining to track the snarls growing closer behind her. The predators snarled behind her, but she forced herself to focus, remembering Marshall's words, "Keep your mind clear. Panic kills." When the simulation ended, she was breathing heavily but standing tall. Marshall gave her a small nod of approval. Next was Ilix, whose scenario involved a spacewalk gone wrong. With his oxygen levels depleting and his suit punctured, he had to act fast. His clawed hands struggled with the repair kit, but he remembered Ennie's steady focus and managed to patch the suit just as the simulation ended. When all the students had finished, Marshall addressed them one last time. What you've just experienced is the essence of survival. It's messy. It's terrifying. But it's possible because you have the most adaptable tool in the galaxy, your mind. He gestured to the mirror again. When you look at yourself, I want you to remember this. You are stronger than you think. Just as Ennie overcame her fear in the jungle and Ilix turned doubt into action during the spacewalk, you too can rise above any challenge. That strength can carry you through anything. And whether you're human or not, that strength can carry you through anything. The room was silent as his words sank in. A Zalithian's frills quivered in contemplation, his gaze distant as if reliving the trials he'd faced moments ago. Beside him, a Cathari student clasped her hands tightly, her luminous eyes flickering with both determination and the remnants of fear. Across the room, a Sarakian adjusted his posture, his tail curling and uncurling with renewed focus, while a human student exhaled slowly, the weight of understanding settling over her like a calm after the storm. Others exchanged quiet glances, some straightening their posture as if physically bolstered by the realization. Slowly, nods spread through the room, the spark of understanding in their eyes transforming into a collective determination. As the session ended and the students prepared to leave, Ennie and Ilix lingered for a moment. "Thank you," Ennie said softly, her glowing eyes meeting Marshall's. He smiled faintly. "You're ready." Outside, as they walked down the corridor, Ilix turned to Ennie. Do you think we'll ever face something like that for real? I don't know, she replied. But if we do, we'll remember what we learned here. And we'll survive. As they disappeared into the bustling halls of the academy, the mirror in the classroom reflected only the quiet, empty space, a final reminder of the lessons that would linger long after the students had moved on.